All right. Good morning from Bogota, Colombia. Let's hope that my internet lasts throughout the entire podcast. Rob, I'm finally in a place as exotic as you. How is it going?
I know what world travelers we are. Oh la la. Bogota,
Ooh la la.
Paris.
Yeah, we're just living the dream. We're going to start with everybody's favorite podcast segment, which is a little bit of micro geopolitics, which is sort of strange to do in a city as big as Bogota. I think the previous times I've done this micro geopolitics shtick, I've been in small cities in the Midwest that really aren't that big, and no offense to those cities, have relatively simple stories. Bogota does not have a simple story, and it's a huge city. It's over 7 million people. It's the third highest capital in South America in the world after Quito and La Paz. It's 8,660 feet above sea level. You can imagine that that's disorienting for me coming from New Orleans. And it's the only mega city that is that high in general. It's the geography of the city is really interesting. I don't, and maybe you can think of a city, Rob, that is like this. I can't really think of a city that has similar geography. Most great cities and capital cities in the world are built around rivers for obvious reasons. And the Bogota River is here, but it's not what the city is based on. It actually sort of forms the westernmost edge of the city. It's bordered on the eastern side by a part of the Colombian Andes, which sort of limits the growth of the city in general. But Bogota itself is basically on a high plateau, and I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, but it's called the Altiplano Cundiboyacense. Sorry about that. I do not speak Spanish. And it's basically this big savanna that opens up in these huge mountains. If you're watching on YouTube, you can get a glimpse of the mountains behind me because my hotel room has a ridiculously incredible view. So it's this high plateau in general. And then the southern part of the city is bordered by something called a Paramo ecosystem, which I'd also never really heard of. It's sort of an alpine tundra ecosystem. It's sort of all high tropical vegetation above a continuous timberline. So as you can imagine, it's sort of a really interesting combination of plants and shrubs and grasses and all these other things. Some scientists have called these types of paramos evolutionary hotspots, meaning that it's one of the fastest sort of evolving regions on the Earth today, which is pretty interesting. So it's a really interesting geography. Can you think of another city like this, Rob, that is a capital city, that is a heart of commerce for a nation, and which is not explicitly based on a river, where a river actually forms a border for the river rather than the actual heart of the city itself?
I really can't. And did you do any work on how
Yeah,
Bogota
so it's
became
and
what it
this,
is today?
like
I
in
mean,
some
it
of the
does
other
seem
earlier
unusual.
editions we did of this, this is where we get into indigenous history. But again, the history here goes back much further. So human or evidence of human activity in this area on this savanna goes back as far as 5,000 BCE. Human activity here though really picks up around 1,000 BCE to 500 CE when you get this migration that eventually becomes the Muisca people. I'm probably butchering that pronunciation as well. And this was another really interesting thing to learn about, which I was surprised I had never really heard about before. Have you heard of these people, the Muisca Confederation, Rob? I mean, I feel like in grade school, I was taught about the Aztecs and I was taught about the Incans and I was taught about the Mayans. But the Muisca belonged right in there with them. So they had a massive confederation and it was a fairly loose egalitarian society. That made me want to compare them to the Iroquois. But when I was doing some research, actually, the analogy that most often came up was the Achaean League in Greece, which was really interesting. But basically, so at the time that the Spanish get here in the mid 1500s, there's somewhere between 1 million and 3 million Muiscas who are living on this plateau in general, and they have a fairly well-established civilization. And Bogota itself, and this goes back to, this is one of the great things about microgeopolitics, the way that things always seem to be the same throughout history. This was the trading center for the Muisca people. And it was also, it was interesting. They had a lot of different mining interests in the area. So Colombia to this day is still the primary producer of emeralds in the world. There's a lot of coal, there's copper and gold. You can think of the El Dorado myths. But the thing that the Muisca were most famous for, and which they valued most highly, was salt. And salt was actually the currency that they used for the Muisca Confederation. And they would have markets all the time where they would bring their salt and their other things that they mined to the markets. And then they would trade their salt for fruits and vegetation and things that they couldn't grow in the sort of weird geography that they were in before. So it was always a commercial center and a hub for relationships with the coastal communities, mining salt in exchange for the things that they were getting from these coastal regions. And the Muisca people themselves, like, call themselves the salt people, apparently, which I could have gone down a rabbit hole for a long time there in general. The other thing that I thought was really interesting, this doesn't have anything to do with the Muisca, but when the Spanish arrived, they would have arrived to a city which Bogota, at least at some point in the far distant past, was probably a lake. And the lake had dried up by hundreds versus millennia ago. But there were still lots of wetlands in the Bogota region, and it would have sort of been a very swampy place when the Spanish arrived. And this was something depressing for me. If in the 1960s there was over 120,000 acres of wetlands in the Bogota region, that has dropped down to I have that in hectares, I guess. It has dropped down by 98%. So the wetlands of Bogota have almost completely disappeared. And I said the Bogota River itself, sort of forms the edge of the city. It's also become a focus for industry in general because of the hydropower potential and things like that. But it's another really interesting thing about Bogota itself, because the main river of Colombia is not the Bogota River, which is a sort of a relatively small tributary of the Magdalena River, which is the real social and environmental and economic heart of Colombia. So it's home to 80% of the country's, almost 50 million inhabitants. The basin produces 86% of the country's GDP, 70% of its agricultural production, 70% of its hydroelectric energy. So, I mean, Bogota is technically part of that river basin, but the Bogota River really is a tributary off of that. The Bogota is not on that main city in general, which connects the entire country for itself. I would encourage listeners to go look at a map. You get a river that goes from Barranquilla in the north and goes all the way to where the southern border terminates. So in that sense, Colombia is a country, even though it feels mountainous and has all these different types of geographies, that is based on a river and is based on the interplay between these people in these mountain savannas and these people on the coast and the people in the more low-lying areas. It's a pretty fascinating sort of geography in general. So that was a long way of answering your question, Rob, which is to say that I guess the reason that it developed that way was just because you had this plateau that people could settle on, and it was a place where they could do agriculture and where they could take the things that they mined or got from their regions in general, and they made it this commercial, cultural center of their civilization. And even today, now Bogota has become the center of Colombia. Although I told a couple friends that I was going to Colombia, and the first thing they said to me was, well, can you go to Medellin? Can you go to Cartagena? Like, you don't want to stay just in Bogota. And I mean, I've loved Bogota. I haven't been out that much, but like, it's been absolutely great. So I can't really imagine something that's been better than this. But yeah, it's been pretty interesting. The last thing I'll say before we turn away from microgeopolitics, or if you have any other thoughts you want to interject, Bogota, like it didn't react well to Spanish conquest. So it remained a fairly small provincial city, even if it was a colonial sort of center, for a long time. Its first major period of growth happens from 1870 to 1912, where the population triples. And then the population doubles again from 1938 to 51, and again from 51 to 64. But it's a fairly sleepy place from sort of the obliteration of the Muisca people in the mid-1500s until about the late 1800s. Which again, that's even 50, 60 years after Colombian independence. So it took a while for Bogota to reinvent itself as this modern commercial center for what modern Colombia looks like today. It also, I mean, and this is true of Colombia in general, Colombia is a country with a tremendous history of violence in its recent past. And, talking to people here, even 20 years ago, Bogota was a much different place and a much less safe place. Whereas today, like, you don't want to go apparently to southern parts of the city, but I didn't feel that uncomfortable walking around. The hotel does have really intense security. I did notice that, but the city itself does not feel unsafe. So I cannot think of another city quite like it, and we haven't done microgeopolitics, or I have not traveled to that many sort of former colonial outposts for the Spanish in the New World. So maybe if you go to La Paz and Quito and some of these other places, you'll have similar stories. But I was really struck by the structure of the city. I can't think of an analogous city sort of in the back of my mind. Maybe the listeners can.
And can you compare and contrast it to Mexico City? I mean, just in terms of being another city kind of centrally located on a plateau, like are there any similar characteristics, or are those emerging from very different places?
I haven't been to Mexico City, so I hesitate to say too much, but my understanding of Mexico is that it was based around water, that it was an intricate canal system that the Aztecs used to build the city in general. I don't know if there's a river that runs through Mexico City, but it seems to me that water plays a much more critical role in the emergence of Mexico City than it did here in Colombia, where it was a border for a city and something that when industrialization came, it was something that they took advantage of. But it wasn't what the city itself was based on and sprang up around. Whereas my understanding of Mexico City is that it was like water did play that major role. But maybe if we dived a little bit deeper, it would. Mexico City is also, I mean, it's probably triple the size of Bogota. I mean, Bogota is 7-8 million people. Mexico City's, makes almost any other city look small by comparison. So. I do think you're right that there's probably something in the idea of Mexico City being a cultural and economic and political power center ruling over a vast domain. And when you get to the borderlands up in the north or in the south, it's hard for that state to really impose complete authority. So you get the rise of bandits or drug cartels or whatever else. That's probably true in Colombia as well. I mean, when you get this mountainous geography and these valleys interplayed between mountains and things like that, like it's hard for the government itself to establish writ. That might be one similarity, but I'd have to. This means we have to go to Mexico City, Rob, so that I can continue. Not because we need clients or anything else. It's because I have to do my next micro geopolitics segment. So
you have to measure the tundra.
Exactly. So any listeners that want to tell me more about this, I'm obviously a novice here, but that was my interesting research about Bogota going forward. We're going to talk a little bit about Macron and French politics at the end of the podcast, but we wanted to start the conversation here about a topic that seems to have captured the imagination, certainly of Mr. Market, as you like to say, Rob, and it seems to be something that everybody is talking about, which is artificial intelligence. And I know, Rob, that the reason or sort of the immediate cause for you wanting to talk about this was Apple and their, what is it? I don't know what WWDC actually stands for. Is it just their annual meeting, or is it some special thing that Apple does? I don't actually know what it is.
It's the Developer Day.
Oh, Developer Day. Yeah. Hot diggity. And so Apple has sort of been famously slow on the uptick with artificial intelligence. Maybe that's unfair, and we can talk a little bit about that in general. But basically, they use this development day to unveil their pursuit of, or their integration of artificial intelligence into their devices and into some of the things that they're doing. But I know that you wanted to take a step back and talk a little bit about artificial intelligence and how you're framing it in general. Maybe before we do that, though, do you want to just talk briefly about what exactly Apple said they were going to do, Rob? Do you have sort of a sense of what they did, or do you want me to lay that out?
You can lay it out, and I'll jump in if there's anything to comment on.
Okay, so they're calling it Apple Intelligence. And it's going to come with new versions on the iPhone, the iPad, and operating systems there. I have to confess that I'm not overly impressed by what they announced. They talked about things like, Siri is going to get some serious upgrades, and Siri is going to be able to talk to Chat GPT behind the scenes. You're going to be able to use AI for image search within the iPhone itself and with the camera feature and do stuff there. There's going to be there's a lot of stuff related to search, which is going to make AI more integrated into the search part of it. There's going to be a sort of smart password protector that's going to help ensure more privacy. It's also like in general, it feels like the AI features that Apple's is creating is going to be about carrying out actions between apps, which again, to me, sort of falls flat. It's like now you can tell the phone to go into an app and tell it to do something. So you can now tell Spotify to put on the podcast itself that you were trying to listen to, or you can use the AI writing tools to say, go write this email with this particular tone and go back for it. They really played up this idea that Siri is now going to be a rainbow ring around the edge of your screen. What else? Oh, I also, in one of the roundups I was reading, they were talking about how there's going to be this thing called Genmoji, where AI is going to help you build like a digital avatar of yourself so you can send pictures. I honestly, like, all of this makes me yawn. Like, none of this is particularly scintillating to me, and I might play the sort of role of AI skeptic on this podcast in general, because I'm here in Bogota I gave a presentation yesterday, and it wasn't that bad a set of data, but I had an Excel file that was not the cleanest in the world, and I didn't want to spend the time cleaning it up and creating a chart from it. So I said, ChatGPT, can you take this and clean it up for me? And it couldn't. It sort of got 75% of the way there, but it could not figure out the correct way to make the x-axis. And I had to literally, to get it to do what I wanted it to do, I had to go in and type, no, for this year, put this data. For this year, put this data. And so I spent 30 minutes chatting with ChatGPT to create a chart that if I had just done it myself, it probably would have looked nicer and would have been better anyway. And so I ended that with like, man, this ChatGPT stuff. So anyway, I'm going on an old man, get off my lawn rant. So that's what Apple did. Why don't you tell me why I'm wrong or why artificial intelligence is going to change the world, even if I can't figure out how to make an Excel chart?
I'm glad that you responded that way, because I think it sets up nicely what I want to talk about, which isn't necessarily, oh, here's all the great things about AI. This is such a huge topic that I'm almost reluctant, or I have been reluctant to talk about it on the pod, because it's very, very important, but it's almost so big, it's difficult to wrap your arms around. And what I mean by that is, there's a lot of different things to go into, and maybe I'll just kind of hit the high level points of what I'm thinking on AI. And, if the listeners are anything like me, like as soon as I hear AI on some podcast, I roll my eyes and don't want to listen, because you can get any number of pods out there of VC bros, waxing about how incredible this is, or how to make money on NVIDIA and blah, blah, blah. And I don't think that's very interesting. And I do want to talk about specific investment implications. But I think we have a very differentiated view. And maybe that's the best place to start, is in the very tangible world of how do you act in relation to all this, and in response to all this, because our remit is to navigate clients through like generational changes in wealth. And as we've talked about in the past, the two big things that drive that are technology revolutions, number one, and geopolitical tectonic shifts, number two. So that's what we focus, most of our research on. And AI is really embedded very deeply into both of those things. And I think at the very high level, I could say AI is both vastly overestimated and overhyped, and vastly underhyped at the same time. If you want to think of this as the S-curve of new technology adoption, what you just described is the S-curve, which is, oh my God, there's all this hype. There's been an explosion of interest. Everyone is spending tens of billions of dollars to build AI data centers, and it's not that great, And I think my gut is that we're entering the initial dip of the S-curve. You know what the concept of an S-curve is, right? In terms of, okay.
I do, but explain it to the listeners, because they might not.
An S-curve of technology adoption basically says it charts the course of people's sentiment toward the technology. So a new technology is invented, you have an initial burst of enthusiasm as everyone speculates about all the great things it can do. And then inevitably, after that initial burst, you have a period of disappointment where the initial applications don't work that great. They require, a lot of kinks to get out. That sort of thing. And then you have sort of the trough of despair, as they call it, where everyone's hopes have been deflated and everyone is, very disappointed with the technology. And you have the dip. So picture a curve going up and then a curve going way down again. And then you sort of get on a more stable intermediate path where they start working out the kinks. It starts to actually be deployed in a way that makes sense. And you sort of have a slower, more steady adoption and growth of enthusiasm. So that's sort of the middle part of the S. So that's the way to think about this process. And we haven't commented too much on AI throughout the whole initial burst of enthusiasm, but now that the burst is giving way to the wah wah, I think it's worthwhile pointing out that is, in fact, I think happening, but also what are the implications, right? So from an investment standpoint, here are the things that I think are really important to take away from this. I said AI is both overhyped, which it is, and drastically underhyped, because the biggest technology revolution, not to say the thing that everyone knows, but the biggest technology revolution of our lifetime so far has been compute. And AI really is the end game of compute. People traditionally spoke about semiconductors as converting sand into mind. And I really like that analogy. And if you really think about this, at one end of that chain, you're literally taking rocks out of the ground in China and smashing them up and putting them through the Siemens process to get silicon. And then at the very other end of this, you have, people in San Francisco or Paris that are training these models and turning out agents that are remarkably human-like in their ability to, mimic language and generate language and image and, all these things. Everyone knows this, right? But it's worth thinking about this as the sort of end of a process that's been going on for a very long time, rather than necessarily something new. And ultimately, what I want to say from an investment standpoint, and we can get into a lot of the other, kind of historical corollaries and sort of what this means, at the very big picture level. But from a purely investment standpoint, I think the takeaways are that AI is the pinnacle of this long development. That if you think of compute as any other communication technology, which sort of has this pendulum that swings between centralization and decentralization, that AI, I think, is heralding the beginning of a move back toward decentralization, which from an investment standpoint means big tech is not going to enjoy the sort of benefits, the monopoly power that they've had in recent decades. And there's a lot of specific reasons for that we can talk about if we want. But basically, the notion of kind of having the value add, the value capture, the profit generation of this industry concentrated in a small number of giants who are increasingly encroaching and putting their tentacles into more and more of your life, that is reaching its endpoint and moving back in the other way. And I think the reason why the Apple WWDC conference was so important was because it really crystallized that crisis that's coming around. Because there's been a number of other things. I'm sure people sort of read the news where Google is rolling these things out. Microsoft just put out this recall function with its new computers, which are essentially spying on your computer and taking. Have you seen this? Where they take, essentially screenshots of whatever you're doing on your computer, and they're scanning them. And I mean, there was a big blowback from this, but Apple has come out and, as you said, like, oh, it was really disappointing. I don't get excited about this. I think the choices that they made strategically really embody this crisis that's happening, because Apple is not going whole hog into what AI could become. And I think they recognize where this is leading, and they don't want to go where Google and Microsoft are naturally forced to go. And they don't have to yet, because Apple has a very strong business and they're trying to retain their roots, which is as, an empowerment vehicle for individuals. The company that emphasizes privacy and emphasizes sort of security more than any other. And the fact that they came out and they took such a cautious approach, I think really shows that we're entering the disappointment part of the S curve, and B, that they sort of recognize and are struggling with this shift between centralization and decentralization, and they're trying to navigate that, but it's a razor's edge. And it both highlights what the others are doing in a starker contrast, but it also presents an interesting dilemma, because I don't know if Apple will be able to retain this long term, but it does sort of show that battle that's happening between people who always viewed computing and by extension AI now as as sort of a decentralizing empowerment vehicle for individuals. Like the early days of computing and internet, the early pioneers thought, oh, this is going to be great. It's going to empower all of these little niche things in the world. They did not imagine that we would all be staring at the same stupid TikTok videos like zombies, right? That was not the vision. So now we're sort of way down that path of centralization and monolith type companies, and I think this is someone has rung the bell for that to start moving in the other way. That's the very high level there.
Yeah, I have a couple different questions and ways I want to tackle that. We'll see if we get to all of them. First is going to be a complete and total aside based on your lovely description of turning sand into mind. I'm going to go back to my yeshiva days for a second and remember studying a book called Lowly Man of Faith, which was written by Joseph Soloveitchik with Rabbi Jason Lieb. Rob, Jason, you probably don't even know I have a podcast, but if you're listening, hello, nice to see you. And Rob Soloveitchik in this book talks about how there's two types of person and their archetypes. It's not like you're one or the other, but there's Adam 1 and Adam 2. And the way that he sort of describes them, I forget which is which, but one of them sort of looks at a waterfall and does exactly what you did, says, oh my God, isn't this incredible that the water that came from the planets and the cosmos then gets blah, 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 blah. This is amazing. Like everything must be part of God's plan. And then the other one that looks at the waterfall and says, if we do this, this, and this is the perfect dimensions for the ritual bath. So if we just, like, God has given me this thing. So if I just make the ritual bath, I can like put it here and there and boom, like I'm going to tame civilization. Everything's going to be great. And he talks about how all human behavior is sort of this battle between Adam 1 and Adam 2. So you made me think of that. I haven't thought about that in decades. So thank you so much. I want to go after the tech giants thing. I want to go a bit about the Apple thing and some of the challenges that they're going to face in doing what they're doing. But I think the place to start, and I hate to bring him up, but Peter Thiel, years ago now, made a lot of headlines when he created, and maybe it's a false dichotomy, but he talked about how sort of blockchain and AI were the two big technologies on the horizon. And I remember that he talked about how AI was authoritarian and blockchain was individualistic. And that he sort of threw himself, not that he threw himself in with blockchain in general, but that he was worried about artificial intelligence from the point of view that China was probably going to dominate it, that they had the massive amounts of data to have first mover advantage, that they had a government that wanted control, that doesn't matter if you throw out the individuality of it. They would love a system that tells them exactly what people are doing and how they're going to behave and what they can do and things like that. And that in some ways, for Thiel, blockchain was the answer to that, about preserving individuality in a world that was going to become sort of moving towards centralization. Do you want to attack that dichotomy? Do you think it's false? Do you think, I'm also struck by, I think it's hard not to pair blockchain and AI because I feel like we've ping-ponged back and forth for the last 2 to 3 years about what is the technology that's going to change. And it's either we get Bitcoin mania or NVIDIA mania, and then it goes back to Bitcoin mania and then back to NVIDIA mania. Like, these seem to be the two technologies that everybody is obsessed about. So I wanted to give you a chance to riff on that. I wonder where you're going to take it.
No, I think that dichotomy is right. And let's take Apple as a very specific example, because Apple sort of sits at the crossroads of both of those two trends. As you said, as you pointed out, everyone was expecting Apple to come out and say, hey, we're going to build all these data centers. We're going to turn Siri into, something better than OpenAI and blah, blah, blah. And they didn't do it. But that is the one side of the dichotomy. It's, if you want to think of it in terms of pure hardware, it's the struggle between centralized data centers, software as a service, cloud computing, versus distributed compute, edge computing. And this is one of the big debates in AI, is how much of this is going to actually happen at the edge. So in other words, the thing in your pocket, how much of the computing, how much of the inference is going to happen on your phone, for instance, versus in these megalith data centers that are, just these enormous NVIDIA GPU sort of third-party providers. And Apple has come out and definitely put their chips on the side of the edge with this, because what they announced is that they are going to be centralizing most of these functions that you point out. It's going to happen on your phone for the purposes of privacy, and that they're building what they're calling private cloud compute, which they're building themselves and hosting themselves, and they've put out the architectural specs around this. And suffice it to say, they've gone to great lengths to anonymize and protect and make private anything that you're doing where you have to tap into those data centers. So they're going to great expense to try to move away from, Google, which will basically like crawl up your butt and read your mail and do whatever they can to get information about you, because that is, that's a different business model. So, Apple has come out, and that I think illustrates this. But from a blockchain perspective, Apple is potentially one of the most interesting kind of blockchain or crypto players out there that no one talks about. And you mentioned the password app that Apple announced. That's probably the most interesting thing that no one is talking about from this event, because that suggests they're getting another foot into that sort of blockchain and identity area. And what I mean by that is Apple is extremely good at developing very secure hardware and very secure chips. Like, out of anything out there, the Apple chips on your iPhone are the hardest to break into and get your data and get your identity and steal it. And the fact that they're moving down into this direction suggests that they're trying to do more with making your phone sort of a secure, castle for you to keep your stuff. And that's the idea, or one of the ideas around blockchain, is not only, will it be used for payments and transactions, but, associated with that idea is the notion of like, it's confirming your identity. Like, this is Jacob making this transaction. It's not, the other Jacob Shapiro from Princeton. Like, we know the difference because this is on, on a secured system and a secured blockchain. So, I guess what I'm getting at is this is very much against the AI ethos in many ways, because that is being done at scale, for most of the companies that are on the cutting edge. And as you point out, Apple's not on the cutting edge of doing this. They're taking a very withdrawn, sort of subdued, cautious approach. Their competitors are all taking the centralized approach, the anti-blockchain approach, where, the antithesis of what Apple's trying to do is Microsoft, which is going to give you a computer, and they're going to take they're going to take photos of whatever you're doing and store it on their centralized servers. And, Google's going to read your Gmail, and they're going to try to, people speculate that Google could maybe try to make their own phone and really put significant investment and effort into building this out in a way that really goes hard and all in on AI and sort of taking your data and personalizing it to you and embedding it into what you're doing. And in many ways, AI requires that to work. So anyway, I'm sort of losing the thread here, but I think it's a useful way to think about it, and a useful way to think about that pendulum swinging back and forth, and which side wins. The other kind of thing to just think about also is, from an investment standpoint, you mentioned, Bitcoin going up and down, and that's sort of a speculative asset. One of the most striking things is that AI has many investment opportunities in these, monolithic tech companies that are trying to build this out and provide it and hopefully get paid for it. As an aside, I don't think those are good investment opportunities. I think they're going to be greatly disappointed, based on the S-curve issue that we talked about, but that's a separate thing. But then at the same token, blockchain has very few investment opportunities. And that's really striking, because if you talk to people who actually invest in this area, one of the things that's so remarkable about blockchain is, because of the nature of what it is, there aren't many entities that just extract profit or value add that can be, that has enterprise value, that is worth something. Because of the nature of what it is, you're not centralizing the value creation in one entity and then extracting a margin. It's diffuse. It's decentralized. So I think it underlines the point of, if you do think that we're shifting toward a decentralized, system, and the pendulum is moving the other way, when you look at your stock portfolio and 30% of it is dominated by NVIDIA and Google and Microsoft and all of these very big tech companies, I think you have to question, to what extent are those massive centralized profits sustainable for the long term? Because if you look at the valuations that they're given today, right now Microsoft is a $3.2 trillion company. That's 41 times the free cash flow they're going to generate this year. So put another way, if you were to buy Microsoft today, it would take 41 years for them to pay you your money back at current levels of profitability. So that's quite aggressive.
Yeah, again, there's a bunch to get into there. One funny exercise that I did in preparing for this podcast was I asked ChatGPT what it would compare artificial intelligence to in terms of general purpose technologies that made change. And it first tried to say, oh, artificial intelligence is like nuclear power. And I was like, I don't really think that works for, nuclear power, like, didn't actually change things like it changed some things economically, but it wasn't like a massive change in the market. It sort of changed global geopolitics meaningfully. I was like, I don't think that works. Can you give me another one? And then it compared itself to the internet. And when I said, I don't really see that, it tried to compare itself to industrialization. So it was actually fun to watch ChatGPT squirm as I asked it to try and compare itself to other different technologies that were out there. But let's I want to zero in a little bit on the investment thing that you said there, because I mean, you're exactly right. Like, the valuations for Microsoft and Apple and Google and all these companies are out of whack. But we've also sort of talked about for the last 4 to 5 years now that they've been out of whack. And I confess that there are some days where I look back and I think, for all of our smartness, maybe I should just buy more Apple stock, because it just keeps going up. And it continues over the last 5 years. It's up 233%. Oh, I'm sorry, that's Microsoft. Microsoft's up 233% over the last 5 years. Apple's up 342% over the past 5 years. I want to believe the vision of decentralization asserting itself, because I think that's a better world, honestly. But isn't the devil's advocate that the tech companies are already up our butts, and that it's not really going to be a thing where you can push back in a meaningful way, that you can sort of in your own personal ways maybe protect your data and your information by using certain types of blockchain technology, but that, like, these tech companies are the center through which everything is going to orbit if these things are going to change? Tell me why you think decentralization is the move, and why now is the moment where the big tech companies might falter.
Yeah, I mean, there's two responses to what you just said. The first is it all depends on your time horizon. At one extreme, you can say, is Microsoft going to go up in the next 10 minutes? At the other extreme, you can say, what is it going to be 50 years from now? And everyone's time horizon falls somewhere between those two things. So I think it's important to clarify when we talk about investing, like we're mostly thinking through the prism of, okay, like our clients are dealing on a 10 to 20 year time horizon. Like if you bought Microsoft today or in 2021 or 2023, is that a good underwritten investment over that time horizon? So, people can quibble about different things and whatever within that, but that's just to frame that. I think that's an important clarification. The other thing is, so what specifically is going to cause this? So let me give some very concrete things, because I talk about, centralization and decentralization, blah, 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 like all this very highfalutin stuff. Here's what's happening, or here's where things are going on the ground that I think are driving this. So the first thing is twofold. The first is the asset intensity of all these businesses is going up dramatically because they're having to throw a massive amount of resources into building this, and the monetization, the return, is very uncertain. So just think about this for a second, and this is a very simple concept. Like, everyone is excited about AI as an investment theme. Well, AI is only interesting if the end user is going to spend a ton of money for it. I mean, that's the basic fact. Like, Nvidia makes a ton of money because they're selling picks and shovels to the people who are hoping to make money from you and me and the business down the street, and from the big enterprise that might spend on this. But that is highly uncertain. And even if you look at something like a Microsoft, which is operating right now in a period of just blow the doors out spending on everything tech. Like, we're in the middle of, as I said, the beginning part of the S curve we just finished. Every startup on earth just raised a ton of money and bought a bunch of GPU capacity, and they're all training their models, and they're all using Microsoft Azure, and all the enterprises are using Azure and saying, oh my God, what are we going to do about AI? Like, this is the moment when you're in the fat part of the curve, right? And even then, Microsoft is growing their balance sheet much faster than they are their profits and their revenues. So what does that mean? It means, so their balance sheet, their PP&E, the amount of stuff they have to invest into their business, the coal they have to throw into the furnace, is growing 25 to 30% per year. Their profit is growing in the low teens. So what that means is the return on capital for Microsoft and for Google, with the exception of Apple, this is the case of almost all of these businesses. That return on investment is going down. Return on capital is going down, and that is a bad sign. You don't want your 10-year or 20-year investment to have declining return on capital. You want it to have rising return on capital. And even if the environment is as good as it's going to get, and you're seeing that's the canary in the coal mine, right? So like, your efficiency is going down. That's just in the numbers. Like, fundamentally, what's happening, or what's likely to happen over the next few years with this, the first is, at the very high level, AI is really disruptive to all of these companies, because so much of tech is just about who owns the end customer, who owns the relationship. This is why Apple's position is so strong, because everyone has an iPhone in their pocket. You pick it up, you look at it, you're holding it in your hand. They own you, and they can sell access to you. They sold access to you to Google search for years and years, and they made billions and billions and billions just from that. And they're selling access to you to OpenAI now because they own you, and that's their model. And they're very careful about that, by the way. But that's how it is with every piece of tech, because whether it's a piece of software that, like, you're just used to using, like, hey, I'm used to using Bloomberg. It would be a pain in the ass to switch to something else. All my stuff is in Bloomberg. I don't want to switch. The switching costs are high. Um, that is a very powerful thing in tech and in consumer. AI throws a monkey wrench in that because as people increasingly interact with AI, Tim Cook did an interview just today with Marquez, the great technology reviewer, whose channel is great, by the way. He's really good. And he said, you could very likely will be using your phone less in the coming years because you're going to be interacting directly with, other things, AI, voice bots, things where you're not interacting with the user interface in the same way. It's disintermediating the user interface. And even if it doesn't happen all at once, if it happens slowly, it still means that as a user, you're less beholden to whatever that piece of technology is. So say the Bloomberg example, say instead of sitting here and staring at the Bloomberg terminal, 3 years from now, I'm saying, hey, AI chatbot, go summarize, what the latest stuff on the Bloomberg is and just tell me, or, go do this, based on whatever rules. That's a very powerful thing. And that's why, even though they failed, these AI hardware companies, like the Humane Pin and this Rabbit, that were like laughably bad because they were way too early. The fact that they raised money and they launched, I think, is a real canary in the coal mine for a lot of these companies, because for the first time in years and years and years, you're seeing a new hardware format, a new thing that's trying to be the smartphone. And maybe it won't be, a pin or some stupid rabbit. Maybe it'll just be a new smartphone and you primarily interact through AI, and that will be the thing that disrupts. But whatever it is, it's throwing a major monkey wrench in that user interface level. And that is going to take a lot of these monopolies and entrenched positions and shake them up. And the second thing is, just from if that's the front end, at the back end, one of the things that makes it so hard to switch is it just takes a lot of time and cost to switch a piece of software. So if you think about the business software area, usually you get embedded with a piece of business software, you put all your stuff in there, you set up all your stuff, and then you don't want to change, right? The problem for that is it's becoming much easier to change. So like, for example, people still use COBOL, like a lot. Like banks use COBOL. Do you know COBOL is a programming language that has been around since the 1960s, and it's super outdated. No one would ever choose to use it. And they have mainframes that run on COBOL at a lot of banks. And the reason is because it's just a pain in the ass to switch. And what's happening now is people are using AI to automatically write the code that you need to go from COBOL to a modern architecture. And a lot of the COBOL is suddenly going away. If you take that example and you apply it more generally, that is not good for a lot of older software that's sitting and entrenched in something, because it means switching costs go down. And I think that's the overall theme of what I'm trying to say in terms of the profitability of bigger tech companies is switching costs for everything are going down. And as you disintermediate the user, both on the back end and the front end, Microsoft is spending tens of billions of dollars on Azure. All of a sudden, you're less beholden to the Microsoft ecosystem than you were 5 years ago. And you can balance between Microsoft and Google and Amazon and the new player. And it just empowers individuals to keep more of that surplus for themselves by shifting around to different players.
I hear you, but I look forward to the day when AI can displace Microsoft Excel, which I've always been bad at, and can create a chart for myself. It's like mind-boggling to me that these AIs, as you're talking about, can create entire coding languages to get away from something that banks have been using for decades, but that it can't give me a chart based on data that I fed it. Maybe I'm just using the AI wrong. I don't know. I've been trying to use AI because I felt I was being a little bit too curmudgeonly about it. And you sort of said, like 3 to 5 years from now. So maybe it's going to improve that much over the next 3 to 5 years. But it is kind of hard for me to imagine that's where we go going forward. I'm conscious of time because I feel like we could talk for another hour or so. I prepped some stuff on like where geopolitics intersects with AI that we could talk about, or we could just leave it right there and sort of move to France and get back to this. What do you? I'm going to ask you in the podcast. Like, where do you want to go from here?
I think we can preview briefly the geopolitical elements of this because they're very profound, and then sort of leave that for the full conversation for the next time. Because I don't know what you had prepared, but if you sort of take some of these theses and apply them in an international context, like I think it's really important because a lot of these factors that have been contributing to the dominance of large tech companies has been beneficial to the US in particular, because these are all US companies. And as that dominance wanes, that is going to open the door to reduce that dominance, outside of the U.S. And specifically from the AI side of things, I think this is a very important kind of cultural question as well. Is now that you're getting into AI, you're getting into cultural questions that are more uncomfortable and more unavoidable than you had in the past, such as you're no longer just providing tools to people, you have to provide them with answers and decisions. So what I mean is, if you have the Chinese version of the Google AI bot, obviously I know Google isn't operating in China, but you know what I mean. Like, rather than providing you with a series of links, even if they're sort of taking out the stuff that you're not allowed to see, if the Chinese system is developing AI bots, for example, and they have to embody Xi Jinping thought, how does that sort of place them comparatively versus, what does the Saudi AI bot say and do? How do they embed that to sort of reinforce their cultural values? Anyway, this is a huge thing, but just those are some of the things that I think are worth thinking about and talking about.
Yeah, but those are not even like you use the word international. Like those are almost questions that cut to the core of the human condition more than they're explicitly geopolitical. And I agree, and it's why you told me I needed to watch Blade Runner 2049 to prepare for this podcast. And you didn't have to tell me to do that because I do that every time I'm on an airplane anyway because I love Blade Runner. But if you Google geopolitics of artificial intelligence, you can imagine that the SEO really likes that phrase. And so that there are a lot of different companies out there that have written reports because they're trying to get attention, because they're trying to milk the attention on artificial intelligence, say, hey, we're over here, we're doing geopolitics, like you can pay attention to us too. And so I read three of them to prep for this. I read one from Rand, I read one from Brookings, and one from Lazard. And I mean, this can be an intro to talking about this more in the future. But the Rand report, first of all, used a term said we're entering the age of geotechnopolitics, gag me with a spoon right there. But, sort of talked about AI in the way that it is in science fiction, which is that humans organized in nation states will have to work with another set of actors, which are AI-enabled machines of equivalent or greater intelligence and with potentially highly disruptive capabilities. So they're imagining that the robots are going to take over. They also had a really interesting scenario exercise where they talked about the development path for how we get there, and they talked about how it could be the private market wins out so that your Googles and your Apples actually centralize everything and they become the nation states of the future, more powerful than governments themselves. I thought that was an interesting dystopian view. There's a U.S. takeover where the U.S. government decides to basically take over the sector and like establish U.S. government control as a leader to use that to project U.S. hegemony. There's a China scenario, of course, and then there's just sort of a coalition of powers that come together to do this. But again, it's all about technology becoming a geopolitical actor. There's this sci-fi aspect to it where it's like, oh, like the AI is going to be the one firing the nuclear weapons and doing all these things, when it's like they can't even make the spreadsheet. So it's hard for me to get to that in my mind. The Brookings report was a little more vanilla, and it talked a little bit more about sort of the economic impact of AI. But it focused more actually on how AI was going to affect information and how it was going to create direct geopolitical risk through creating deep fake videos and disinformation campaigns and cyber attacks at scale and posing threats to national security and trust in institutions, which I sort of get where they're going with that. But, we've gone from, oh, AI is going to change the world to, oh, it's going to author cyber attacks. Like, okay, like I'm struggling to see like what's so different between that and that. It looks like a difference of degree, not of kind. The Lazard report was in some ways the most interesting. I sort of laughed because they had it was written by 15 geopolitical analysts, none of whom I've heard of, not to toot my own horn, but I've been doing this now long enough that I usually know the names. And I'm like, who are all these people who are claiming to be geopolitical analysts and where did they come from? But it was it was definitely the best report overall. And in part because it made it not about the United States and China. It talked about the different advantages that countries like the UK, Canada, France, Singapore, South Korea have to become AI players in their own rights. And it also did a lot better job of talking about what AI might do from an economic growth perspective and how that might affect governments. But again, it still went back to this this is a competition that's unfolding. It's going to be at the center of U.S. China competition. There's all these new frameworks that are going to be on the horizon. It just didn't actually get into anything where the geopolitics actually gets affected. And I wonder if it doesn't feel like a perfect match. Like you said, I feel like the deeper questions here are going to be about how good the AI gets and what our relationship as humans is to this technology before we even get into how is this going to be used at scale for national competition. I mean, it has certainly become a proxy for U.S. China competition. Like those governments have drank the Kool-Aid to such an extent that the chips that go into the data centers that are supposed to be doing AI, that is the front line of U.S. China competition right now. But I mean, one of the things I've said here over and over and over again is that the reason that China should scare the United States as a rival is not because it's going to usurp the best chips. It's because they make everything else. I don't care if you have the best chat GPT in the world. They're the ones that actually make the screws and the gears and the radio switches and the ships and all this other stuff. So they're going to win any sort of conflict in the long run if they're the ones that are actually making things. That's how the United States became what it did. So now I'm the one who's rambling a little bit. But I had trouble fitting geopolitics into the artificial intelligence bucket and was sort of amused at the contortions of different groups that were out there desperately trying to make artificial intelligence geopolitical when I'm not sure it's advanced enough to be geopolitical yet. I don't know. That's maybe the wrong take, but it's where I landed right now.
Well, we can back burner that for now and revisit because I think we do want to talk about France and we only have a few more minutes, but needless to say, it's a huge topic. And as you can tell from the conversation, I've been reluctant to even get into this because it's very difficult to even kind of coherently attack the issues and split them out because there's so much here. So let's talk about France.
Yeah, let's talk about France for a couple of minutes. I wonder if Emmanuel Macron, I'll do a better segue. I wonder if Emmanuel Macron was sitting down at his desk and looking at the results from the European Parliament elections and how, what are they calling themselves now, Rob? The National Rally? They changed their name and I'm not sure. National Front. Anyway, the far right in France won in the European Parliament elections, roughly 30% to Macron's 15%. I wonder if he was sitting at his desk and he typed into Chat GPT, what should I do if the far right won in European Parliament elections and I'm worried about my position? And Chat GPT said, call legislative elections, because that's what Emmanuel Macron did. He called legislative elections. He has since come out and said he's not going to step down as president, even if things don't go well. So, we're still not looking at major change until 2027. And which is when the next French presidential election is, that he cannot stand for. And I've already seen a couple articles out there suggesting that this is three-dimensional chess for Macron, that he's giving the far right the rope that it needs to hang itself, so that he's sort of welcoming disruption for the rest of his presidency, so that as the far right tries to do things over the next 2 to 3 years, they completely embarrass themselves, and a hand-picked Macron successor will be able to point to their horrible record over the last 2 to 3 years and say, this is garbage. I don't know. That seems even a little smart for him. But for as android-esque as Macron can be sometimes, he has proven himself to be a very savvy political operator and tactician. And we shouldn't forget that he was this young upstart who came out of nowhere, who completely upset France's political spectrum and has become one of the most powerful sort of French presidents in recent history. So he obviously sees something that makes him want to take this gamble and risk. And I'm predisposed to give him the benefit of the doubt based on his previous record. But it does seem it seems like an awful big risk. It seems like strange timing where you're hemorrhaging support in the European Parliament. The Olympics are coming up. It was supposed to be this great time where everybody was going to talk about how great you are and how great France was. Maybe we're staring down a Trump presidency in the United States. That looks more likely by the day. What is, Olaf Scholz is sitting there on his hands in Germany, not doing anything that you're asking Germany to do. I mean, it's a strange time and a difficult time for the goals that Macron has always enunciated. So what's the feeling like in Paris? And how are you feeling about President Macron and his late night chat GPT sessions?
The feeling is not so different from what it usually is. I think there's an element of, pearl clutching, or whatever the French equivalent is. I don't see too many people wearing pearls here. But I mean, a number of thoughts. Number one, don't underestimate Macron, because I think he is a very savvy operator, and his deficiencies are not in intelligence and tactical stuff. His deficiencies are, acting like a human and connecting with people. So I think, there was an interesting piece in Le Monde talking about he had a team of 12 people spending like the last 10 months planning all the different scenarios. If this should happen, should they call, like, this is not a spur of the moment, hey, he just woke up on the wrong side of the bed and decided to do this. Like, there's a lot of thought that's gone into this. So I think he has a strategy or a plan. I think, one of the things that seems pretty clear is as they've gotten bigger, the RN, the Rassemblement National, the National Front, as they used to be called, they've had to try to normalize a bit. And I think that's probably the most likely outcome. It's probably in part what many people in the center are banking on, is the notion that the more ridiculous sides of sort of the old party will be shuffled aside or downplayed if they actually had to take power, much like in Italy, where you saw, a right-wing government come into power that actually turned out to be much more pragmatic than many people were afraid of. I think that's probably the most likely scenario, because there's an element here of just the traditional parties have collapsed in terms of identification and membership. And Macron himself, like, he's not the head of a traditional party. He's basically a one-man band, and his party is, hey, I'm super smart and technocratic, and I'm going to get things done, which is a very tough sell in, this day and age. So I think there's a big element of just sort of protest vote to it. I don't come away thinking, oh, this is going to be, the end of modern France, or this is such a huge deal. I think this is similar to processes that we're seeing in other countries, and he's probably banking on them coming in and either having to do a lot of the stuff that he wants to do anyway, or making such fools out of themselves if they take more extreme views that they're going to discredit themselves and allow him an opening to promote his own, more centrist party in 2027.
That does mean, though, that you think that they're going to do well in parliamentary elections, doesn't it?
The RN, I think they're polling very well as of today. Even in places like Paris, they have surprisingly high support.
I was reading an op-ed about the move, and it talked about some of their platform, which was, it's weird. The author here is obviously very anti the right, and threw in a bunch of different things in their platform as if they were all crazy, and not all of them were crazy. Some of them are crazy, but there was slashing immigration, banning Islamic head coverings in public, dialing back renewable energy investment, but also building 6 new nuclear reactors, lowering inflation by rebating the VAT tax to consumers, expelling foreigners who've been unemployed for more than a year. Watch out, Rob. Lowering the retirement age back to 60, a 20 billion euro national health plan. I think part of the confusion here is how they're going to pay for that, because they're going to be cutting taxes in some way, but also spending some of this money, sort of classic populist stuff. They made fun of Le Pen, who apparently also wants no more restrictions on hunting, which she calls one of France's most ancestral traditions. I hate to go down the rabbit hole of what are France's ancestral traditions and what they've given up for the sake of civilization. But I don't know. Maybe you're right, but it seems more like a high stakes gamble to me. What do you think? What do you think the mood right now is in places like Berlin or in Kyiv? Do you think that Zelensky is worried about sort of France's direction going forward? I know that Scholz has sort of sat on his hands, like maybe he's the next one who's going to have to call elections. Maybe Macron is hoping to push him to that direction so that he can get a Germany that's more pliable to deal with. I don't know. Do you have any sense about how it might go from there?
Here's a speculation. I think in a right-dominated parliament, or even, if a right-wing figure wins the next presidential election, which is still a few years off, so is kind of not worth thinking about right now. It's plausible that they would actually have more leeway in getting things done on Europe, because they would be less, viewed as a European sellout. They would have the bona fides of bashing Europe for years and years as a sort of platform where they could actually try to do something. I mean, you're the expert here. I mean, to what extent do the constraints of the French situation dictate what any leader of France has to do with regard to Europe? Like, I would assume those are quite strong, regardless of the politics internally.
Yeah, I think that's a question we'll have to table for next time also, because I got lost in the time, and I know that you have to go to a meeting as well. So why don't we put a pin in that and come back to it next time? Because I think we've already covered enough for the readers, for the listeners to digest for now, and we'll go from there. I think that's about it. Anything else you want to tell the listeners, Rob?
Nah, let's get out of here.
Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidents podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor.